Okay, here we go. Welcome to our very first ODSECS of the academic year. I am absolutely thrilled to see so many people here on a bright autumn afternoon / morning. And speaking of morning, in this time of great, apparently global surprise that a 96-year-old woman has sadly passed on. So let's all have a moment and be sad about the Queen. Sorry, I've been in England for a few days, and the last few days it's a little wacky. Right. So without any further bizarre preamble, I would like to I have the absolute pleasure of introducing today's speaker. Now, Melissa asked me to keep this introduction short so as to leave plenty of time for discussion. So I will not be waxing lyrical about her first book, The Body Politic, or about her wonderful editing work. See her Roxana, it's really good. Nor will I talk about her Clifford Prize-winning essay on Aphra Behn's widow Ranter, which I have taught about 100 times because it is really so amazingly good. But I will say this. Melissa Mowry is a professor in English at St. John's University. She is a citizen scholar specializing in the complex intersections between politics and imaginative writing in the very long 18th century. Her work asks how literary history constructs knowledge by focusing on community and collectivity rather than individual writers or texts. Her most recent publication, The Simply Wonderful Collective Understanding, Radicalism and Literary History, 1645 to 1745, came out with Oxford last year. And if you haven't had a chance to read it yet, please do. It is simply fantastic. Not just her new look at the levelers, which is a subject near and dear to my heart from being in EGM for many years, but she also argues for the interpretive principles and practices of affiliation and collectivity. Now, I called her a citizen scholar, and I want to return to one of the many ways that Melissa's research, her teaching, and her public work reinforce each other. From her academic leadership at St. John's, an institution like many struggling in these difficult and anti-education times, to her work as a school board director in Abington, Melissa does not just talk the talk, she walks the walk every day, and for that, as well as for her paper and for her published work, I am always grateful. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Melissa. This paper is from her current project on slaves, tyrants, and heroes, a literary political history. Over to you, Melissa.
Thanks very much for that incredibly generous introduction, Elaine. I am really grateful. So I just wanted to start today before I launch into the paper with a few remarks. And they probably make more sense in light of Elaine's introduction. And that is that I'm incredibly grateful to the ODSECS Collective for this opportunity to share this early piece of the next book I've started to work on. I also want to thank my weekly writing group, Andrea McKenzie and Dana Rubin, for sort of sustaining me as I embark on this next project. I'm not sure I'd be this far along without them. And I also want to thank the librarians at the Parliamentary Archives and the Huntington Library who generously helped me get some images that I'm going to be showing you today. I think sometimes our librarian colleagues get not enough recognition, so I wanted to say that this morning. So this is a project that is connected to the book that I just published with Oxford. And it kind of has its genesis in my work on the levelers and this recognition that so much of their political argument is focused on the question of slavery and enslavement, and they really treat it as a political identity. And then a slightly later realization that Olaudah Equiano starts his narrative by distancing himself from precisely the terms that dominated that 1640s political discourse, So he starts on that first page by saying that his is not a story in which you will find, I think it's slaves, heroes, and tyrants, right? And so it's from that disclaimer that I'm borrowing the provisional title for this next work. Okay, so Elaine, if you could put those dates up, that would be great. Okay, so I wanted to, before I launch into the argument, offer just kind of a timeline, because if you're anything like me, it's pretty easy to get lost in the sequence of events. So the Salisbury conspiracy that the petitioners were indentured for takes place early 1655, late 1654. A year later, those conspirators are sent to Barbados as indentured servants. In 1656, Elizabeth Key has her freedom affirmed under common law in the Virginia colony as the Christian daughter of a freeborn Englishman. 3 years later, in March, 2 of the indentured servants are given permission to travel to England and present a petition to Parliament on behalf of the indentured cavaliers. No decision is reached. And the sequence of events gets pretty compressed here. In September of that same year, 2 news books print notification of letters arriving from Barbados relating the discovery of a conspiracy among the island's enslaved Africans to rebel. 2 years later, the royalist governor on Barbados signed into law the Act for the Better Ordering and Governing of Negroes and the Act for the Good Governing of Servants and Ordering the Rights between Masters and Servants. The following year, Virginia passed its notorious slave code, depriving the children of enslaved Africans and white colonists of recourse to common law, declaring that any child of an enslaved African woman was also enslaved. And finally, in 1663, Charles II charters the Company of Royal Adventurers of England trading into Africa. Okay, so I guess maybe we can keep these dates up while I start the paper, because they'll pop up in the course of it. All right. So on March 25th, 1659, Marcellus, Rivers, and Oxenbridge Foyle presented a petition to the Third Protectorate Parliament on behalf of themselves and 70 other Cavalier soldiers who'd been sent to Barbados as indentured servants for their part in the Salisbury conspiracy of 1655. Claiming they had been unjustly and illegally sold into slavery, the soldiers requested the right to sue Martin Noell, Henry Hatsell, and Thomas Aldern, 2 of whom were sitting MPs, for reparations. Commonly referred to as the Slaves Petition by historians, both the petition and the pamphlet it inspired have been seen as tangential to the larger political conflicts that had swept across Great Britain in the 1640s and 50s, as well as the rise of racial capitalism in the Atlantic world. That view, however, fails to take into account 2 facts. Both petition and pamphlet explicitly co-opted the deeply consequential rhetoric of 1640s dissidents that centered the tyrant slave dyad in its arguments for political change. And mere months after Rivers and Foyle presented their petition, Barbadian colonists reversed the political polarities of that dyad when they claimed to have uncovered a conspiracy among the island's enslaved Africans, likewise seeking political change, but led by an African prince. As part of my argument here, I want to suggest, along with scholars such as Jennifer Morgan, Marissa Fuentes, and Michelle Wright, that the linear progress narratives that have long defined cultural, literary, and political inquiries have produced myopias that have made it difficult to hear the voices of those pushed to the literate margins of the Atlantic world. Producing a variety of hermeneutic approaches to archival material, these critiques address what Fuentes characterizes as the historical dispossession of enslaved and displaced bodies and seek to probe, quote, the archival silences around the lived experiences of enslaved women and others at the birth of racial capital. In addition to reconstituting silence and archival absence as dissidents, however, these hermeneutics also reveal the importance of simultaneity, the powerful necessity of reimagining literary and cultural history, not in terms of singular event horizons that merely move forward, but rather in terms of multiple, sometimes contiguous horizons moving across time that expose meaning in terms of affinities and affections without erasing distinctions. In thus shifting our understanding of historical construction away from linear narratives and singular event horizons, we might take up the challenge laid down by Margot Hendricks and others to, quote, radically change the way we contend with the interconnections between capitalism, colonialism, and race. In the particular case of the 1659 petition, unfolding the multiple simultaneities that structure its meaning not only exposes what Urvashi Chakravarti and Ayanna Thompson describe as race's, quote, claim to offer a heuristics of corporeal legibility, quote, rooted in the contingencies of power, it reveals those contingencies as equally rooted in a specific politics. It's my contention here that the so-called slaves petition was not a singular isolated event, but that it exists in simultaneous relationship to Civil War dissidents and the political reframing of conspiracies to rebel among actually enslaved people. The interfaces between these rhetorical moments and locations reveal that what is often described as an economic transformation, racial capitalism, the commodification of labor, etc., was prepared for by a tectonic shift in England's political imagination, unparalleled in other European colonial powers, that transformed slave from a political position requiring political remedy to a depoliticized economic position counterintuitively aligned with royalism. Excuse me. Chattel slavery, as we know, became a feature of the English colonial world in 1619, when the first enslaved Africans arrived in the Virginia colony. By the 1640s, however, the 17th century the rising specter of human trafficking in the 17th century between Africa, the Americas, and England was on a direct collision course with England's political imagination as the country descended into civil war, and the dyadic tie between tyranny and slavery became the indissoluble cornerstone of dissident arguments against authoritarianism. Over the course of the 1640s, tyranny became so profoundly inextricable from enslavement that enslavement itself became the defining characteristic of tyranny. To be enslaved was to be subjected to tyranny and denied natural political rights. In 1645, William Walwyn, whose pamphlet, England's Lamentable Slavery, and Elaine, if you could flip to the second slide here, that would be great. Oh, that's the wrong one, sorry. That's the one, okay. The Cavaliers' petition echoed in 1659. Let me start that sentence again. In 1645, William Walwyn, whose pamphlet, England's Lamentable Slavery, the Cavaliers' petition echoed in 1659, decried that England's kings had by force conquered the nation, changed the laws, and by strong hand held them, the people, in bondage. Likewise, John Lilburne, in defense of whom Walwyn had written England's Lamentable Slavery, admonished that citizens without free and public choice are, quote, meat slaves to their elected governors. That same year, Walwyn and Lilburne's friend, collaborator, and fellow leveler, Richard Overton, had moved beyond merely lamenting that England's subjects were enslaved to claiming that such a condition created a political imperative that required liberation and justified rebellion. Speaking directly to the House of Commons, Overton proclaimed, quote, for if you or any other shall assume or exercise any power that is not derived from our trust and choice thereunto, that power is no less than usurpation and an oppression from which we expect to be freed in whomsoever we find it, it being altogether inconsistent with the nature of just freedom, which he also very well understand. Dissidents like Walwyn, Lilburn, and Overton never wielded governmental power, but the force of their argument that tyranny creates slavery ultimately resulted in the monarchy's abolition in 1649. In justification of Charles I's trial and execution, John Milton embraced the tyrant-slave dyad in the Tenure of Kings and Magistrates to contend that the bondage into which Charles I had placed his subjects was sufficient reason to justify the king's trial and execution. Quote, to say as is usual, the king hath as good right to his crown and dignity as any man to his inheritance, is to make the subject no better than the king's slave, his chattel, or his possession that may be bought and sold. So I want to be clear here. There's almost nothing in 1640s dissident writing to suggest that those who oppose political authoritarianism during that decade and beyond ever imagined their arguments would be applicable to England's importation of enslaved Africans and indigenous people to its colonies as forced labor. Yet neither was it a foregone conclusion that the revolutionary rhetoric that had brought the monarchy down would not also be brought to bear on the evolving slave trade in England's colonies. Equally at the edges of dissident political arguments and its colonial world, there are faint hints that it might be possible to view England's enslavement of Africans as a form of political disenfranchisement and the consequent rebellions of the enslaved as a natural consequence of its injustice. As late as 1657, Robert Ligon, ruminating on the brutality to which slaves on Barbados were subjected, wondered that, quote, they should not commit some horrid massacre on the Christians thereby to enfranchise themselves and become masters of the island. Why then, a mere 2 years after Ligon published his History of Barbados, would the indentured cavaliers co-opt a political idiom to which they were openly hostile? The most obvious explanation is that the soldiers saw in Cromwell's death 7 months earlier in 1658 an opportunity to exploit England's political instability and turn the tables on their political adversaries. Certainly the Cavaliers' second presentation of their petition in July 1660, and this is, Elaine, this is the handwritten one that you did just before this. Nope, there, that one, okay. So this is the 1660 petition, and at the bottom you can see Oxenbridge's signature and Foyle's signature, as well as two others. So the second presentation of their petition in July 1660 makes it clear that the men harbored a deep antipathy for Cromwell. Pleading with the newly restored House of Lords, Rivers, Foyle, and their confederates accused the men who had sent them to Barbados of being, quote, ready instruments of the Commonwealth, who sought, quote, to advance the late usurping tyrant's designs of destroying the king's faithful servant and subjects. However much the 1660 presentation of grievances unleashed the soldiers' personal antipathy for Cromwell, I want to suggest here that their appropriation of familiar dissident arguments was designed not only to accuse the Commonwealth of hypocrisy, it was also designed to underscore the dangers the tyrant-slave dyad posed to the system of labor, on which the influx of sugar money depended. For as slavery was the consequence of tyranny, and the Commonwealth and / Protectorate were vulnerable to charges of tyranny, then the colonists and plantation owners who held men and women in bondage could also be accused of tyranny. As Jenny Shaw and Susan Amundsen have both pointed out, the soldiers' petition and the subsequent pamphlet, England's Slavery, sought to mask the petitioners' political affiliation with royalism, through provocative descriptions of the conditions to which the soldiers had been subjected, all the while avoiding an explicit acknowledgement that enslaved Africans were similarly subjected to brutality. The men are, quote, bought and sold still from one planter to another, and they are, quote, whipped at their whipping posts as rogues for their master's pleasure and sleep in sties worse than hogs in England. While Jenny Shaw concludes that descriptions such as these, quote, gave voice to those the soldiers suffered alongside, I would argue on the contrary, that those descriptions are fixated on the sadistic behavior of the slave owners for the express purpose of correlating that behavior with the mercurial, often vindictive self-indulgence classically associated with the tyrant, who views, quote, his kingdoms and people are only ordained for satisfaction of his desires and unreasonable appetites. Indeed, the Cavalier's subsequent pamphlet makes this point clear, that the men view themselves as, quote, enslaved by a tyrannical force. It was a canny gambit that forced even the most politically principled MPs to acknowledge that the Protectorate sources of colonial wealth, as well as the labor regime that produced that wealth, violated the very foundations of its own political authority. The parliamentary response to the Cavalier petition suggests that MPs understood perfectly both the political and philosophic implications of the accusation that English plantation owners had become tyrants. Though blandly represented in the House of Commons Journal, the diarist Thomas Burton carefully recorded the high-stakes debate among members of Parliament, exposing the beginnings of the ideological struggle to decouple slave from arguments about political enfranchisement by repurposing the African identity of most Barbadian slaves as a defense against the very accusations tyranny leveled against the English plantation owners. As Burton recorded it, the parliamentary debate itself is organized primarily in terms of three factions, the distribution of which is itself suggestive of the discursive changes slavery was undergoing. Those MPs who were simply anti-Cavalier and rejected the petition on the grounds that Rivers and Foyle were known royalists. Those MPs who were mercantilist and profited from trafficking in indentured servants and enslaved Africans, and those MPs whose political beliefs remained rooted in the radical and dissident communities of the 1640s. Among those present the day of the petition's reading were some of the most significant figures of the Civil Wars, Commonwealth, and Protectorate: Henry Vane, John Desborough, the Regicide, Edmund Ludlow, Arthur Hasselrig, and John Lambert. Members of Parliament moved immediately to expose the allegiances of petitioners and a sure sign that they recognized the political nature of the petition. Sir John Coppleston, who was sheriff when the men were arrested and had personal knowledge of the legal proceedings surrounding the Salisbury Rebellion, confirmed that Rivers was a Cavalier and had, quote, been Prince Maurice's quartermaster. And Prince Maurice was Prince Rupert's brother. Adding to and immediately following Copplestone was Martin Noell, a ship owner who had first made his fortune transporting Irish and Scots prisoners and indentured servants to the Caribbean. The same year that the petitioners were sent to Barbados, Noell had, quote, contracted to transport 1,200 men from Knockfergus, Ireland, and Port Patrick, Scotland, to Jamaica. By 1663, Noell had become a major investor in the Royal Adventurers of England trading into Africa, switching from indentured servants to enslaved Africans. Having been singled out by the petitioners as one of the men primarily responsible for their transportation, Noell's self-defense was predictably vociferous and vilely corrupt. Arguing against Rivers and Foyle's accusation that the Barbadian plantation owners acted as tyrants to their servants, Noell defended both himself and the colonists by insisting that the transported men had better working conditions in Barbados than they might have found in Britain. Quote, they were civilly used and had horses to ride on. They serve most commonly 5 years and then have the yearly salary of the island. They have 4 times of refreshing and work, but from 6 to 6. So it is not so hard as is represented to you, not so much as the common husbandman here. Interestingly, Noell must have sensed that his reframing of plantation work as less arduous than agricultural work in Britain was unconvincing. He continued his efforts to discredit the Cavaliers' claims of enslavement by comparing their work to that of enslaved Africans. Not only did the Cavaliers not work as hard as they might at home, Noell claimed, but on the plantations, they barely work at all because, quote, the work is mostly carried on by the Negroes. It is a place as grateful to you for trade as any part of the world. It is not so odious as represented. In other words, so long as Africans perform the bulk of plantation work, English indentured servants are free from such labor and therefore cannot be enslaved. While Noell's argument was still not entirely persuasive, it made a critical step toward redefining slavery as an economic position that was designed both to profit England and perhaps more importantly, to insulate freeborn Englishmen from being enslaved themselves. According to the logic, according to the logic of Noell's remarks, it was the type and duration of labor that marked individuals as free or slave, and not their position relative to those who held power. Those MPs who voted to hear the Cavaliers' position did so in terms of the Commonwealth's constitutive opposition to tyranny. MPs closely aligned with the sectarian radicals and dissidents were inclined to ignore the petitioners' political allegiances in favor of a more rigorous application of 1640s political principles. Thomas Kelsey, for instance, observed that tyranny is tyranny wherever it be. And Major Beek further observed that slavery is slavery as well in a commonwealth as under another form. Likewise, Henry Vane voiced concerns that any man who would treat other Englishmen as Rivers and Foyle described was engaging in the same oppressive practices as the late king, declaring that he did, quote, not look on this business as Cavalierish business, but as a matter that concerns the liberty of the freeborn people of England. Vane goes on to point out, quote, we have a sense and loathing of the tyranny of the late king and of all that tread in his steps to impose on liberty and property. As I should be glad to see any discouragement upon the Cavaliers, so I should be glad to see any discouragement and indignation of yours against such persons as tread in Charles Stuart's steps. Perhaps an index of the political turmoil that besieged England in early 1659, no decision on the Cavaliers' grievances was reached. Frustrated by Parliament's inaction, Rivers and Foyle and their supporters took to the court of public opinion a few weeks later in an effort to amplify their political argument and gin up public support. And this is the final slide, Elaine. So this is, it should say England's, yep, that's the one. Okay, thank you. In April, Rivers, Foyle, and their supporters printed a pamphlet entitled England's Slavery, which reproduced the Cavaliers' petition, along with 4 letters purportedly sent to unnamed MPs. In addition to the fact that the number of men Rivers and Foyle represented was moderately reminiscent of the large mass subscription petition of the 1640s, the pamphlet imitated the epistolary format of Walwyn's 1645 petition, England's Lamentable Slavery, whose title it also clearly evoked, in which had also presented itself as an epistle, quote, a private letter of public use to the constant maintainer of the just liberties of the people of England. As closely as the title mimics Walwyn's pamphlet, England's Slavery also registers the shifting political arguments whereby claims to political remedy became the exclusive prerogative of white English Protestant men, and African slaves were entirely depoliticized and understood as subjects without remedy. The Cavaliers likely chose the Walwyn pamphlet for a number of reasons, not the least of which was the fact that in the level of Walwyn's title would have seemed most directly applicable to the soldiers' grievances. However, the 1645 pamphlet also presented as substantive challenges to the Cavaliers' claims that as English Christians, they should not be enslaved. Walwyn wrote his pamphlet as a defense of his friend Lilburne, who had been imprisoned for his religious views. For Walwyn, this narrow-minded religious bigotry impeded, quote, the common freedom of the people. And he writes, the craft and delusion of those that would master and control the people hath not availed by fomenting our differences of religion, which is their common practice, to make me judge preposterously either of you or any other man's suffering. Moreover, Walwyn argued the discernment of injustice ought to be completely independent of religious belief or practice. He writes, when I hear of the suffering of any man, I do not inquire what his judgment is in religion. I presently labor to be rightfully informed of the cause of his sufferings, whether that be evil or good, and of the proceedings thereupon, whether legal or illegal, just or unjust. Walwyn's dissociation of religion and justice cut against the grain of the British colonial world, where religion more often than not served equally to justify freedom and enslavement. Richard Ligon, for instance, tells the story of a Barbadian slave who wanted to convert to Christianity and who he had agreed to help. The slave's master rejected the request on the grounds that, quote, being once a Christian, he, that is the owner, could no more account him a slave. In 1656, the same year that the Cavaliers were transported to Barbados, Elizabeth Key won her freedom in Virginia, both on the grounds that she was the daughter of a freeborn Englishman, and that, quote, she hath been long since christened, and that she is able to give a very good account of her faith. Not only did the Cavaliers decline Walwyn's principled ecumenicalism, they embraced national identity as the primary index of who should be free, and therefore who should have access to political remedy. As capacious as 1640s dissident thought sometimes seems, its argument for political justice were often parochial and therefore prone to produce a kind of nativist argument about the origins of the common freedom of the people. Reaching back to an idealized Anglo-Saxon past, writers like Overton observed, quote, the history of our forefathers since they were conquered by the Normans doth manifest that this nation hath been held in bondage. Likewise, a 1646-1647 pamphlet defending Overton against his own unjust imprisonment insisted, quote, wherein, as in a glass, every free man of England may clearly behold his own imminent, insufferable bondage and slavery under the Norman prerogative men of this kingdom, represented by the present suffering of Richard Overton. Picking up on these and other nativist arguments, the Cavaliers reconstituted the levelers' Anglo-Saxon origin story as a limit on rather than a foundation for political grievance. So I'm going to read that last part again because it's important. They reconstituted the levelers' Anglo-Saxon origin story as a limit on rather than a foundation for political grievance. That is, in their insistence that they were transported through an arbitrary power and that as such, quote, a great breach is made upon the free people of England, the Cavaliers emphasized the Englishness of liberty rather than the freedom guaranteed under English law, regardless of religion. Thus, even in the extra-national context of Barbados, the Cavaliers' emphasis remains rooted in concerns about England's slavery. Ironically, the impact of the Cavaliers' nativist argument against their own enslavement is most obvious. I'm just going to preface this. This is where the story gets like kind of crazy, but also really interesting. So the impact of the Cavaliers' nativist argument against their own enslavement is most obvious, not in its impact on indentured servitude, but rather in its displacement of tyranny from slave owners to enslaved Africans themselves. In September 1652, two news books, the Public Intelligencer and the Weekly Intelligencer, published letters received from Barbados relating a conspiracy among the enslaved Africans on the island to rebel against the English colonists. The news arrived from the colony in two letters dated June 1 and June 16, 1659. Appeared first in Marchmont Needham's newsbook, The Public Intelligencer, published by order of Parliament. The first of these letters arguably retains a faint hint of the rhetoric Ligon had used 2 years earlier that acknowledged rebellion as a political remedy. Quote, some Negroes endeavoring to set on foot a rebellion to cut their masters' throats and to work out their own freedom. The second letter, however, takes a different, more disturbing tack, elaborating a trope that would come to be a familiar feature of 17th century descriptions of slave conspiracies to rebel. In pamphlets such as Great News from the Barbados and even Ben's Orinoco attributed such rebellions to the leadership of a prince. Quote, since my last unto you, the governor had a meeting with the council and assembly who appointed some persons empowered by a law for to sit as a court for to make further discovery into this Negro design and to try and cause punishment to be inflicted on such as should be found culpable. The court hath now twice sate, 3 of the chief have already suffered death, one of which was a prince in his own country, a person very intelligible and wise. He hath led armies, it is said, of 10,000 persons against his enemies, and fought both with horse and foot with great and small shot, and was generally victorious, as hath been evidenced by several of his countrymen. He was to have been, we are informed, the chief. The letter goes on to speculate that the African prince was in silent league with the Spanish against whom England had been at war since 1654. But the vignette also served to align the enslaved Africans on Barbados with the interests of royalism. Not only had the Spanish provided sanctuary to the exiled Stuarts in the Spanish Netherlands, but the emergence of an African prince on Barbados seemed to offer the Protectorate real evidence that the Commonwealth installed government on the island was under threat, as it had been in 1650 of being overthrown. Thus, the emphasis on the vignette, on the African prince suggests not that the enslaved Africans sought political rights to which they were entitled as freeborn men from their tyrannical masters, but rather that they were enemy combatants seeking to transform Barbados into a kingdom, and according to the law of war, thus legitimately enslaved. As John Locke would point out notoriously 3 decades later, quote, the perfect condition of slavery is nothing else but the state of war continued between a lawful conqueror and a captive. Like its more official counterpart, the Weekly Intelligencer repeated the sensational Spanish subplot, pushing its political motivations to the surface. From this island, it was also advertised that the Negroes who are many on that island had entered into a barbarous combination for the massacring of all the English whom they could find upon that island, beginning with the governor himself. The chief leader of them is said to be one who had been heretofore a prince in his own country, and who victoriously heretofore hath led an army of 10,000 of his black countrymen against their enemies. But he hath now suffered death with 2 other of the chief ringleaders for his most unmerciful design in attempting against their lives, whom he was bound by the laws of nature to preserve. The odium of this designed massacre was cast upon the Spaniards, who are said to be abettors in it, the truth whereof will hereafter be peradventure more clearly evident. The combined effect of the Cavalier's limitation of the tyrant-slave dyad to a nativist argument about Englishness and the specter of African royalism was to disburden settler colonialism of accusations of tyranny. Indeed, under this emergent episteme, slavery was no longer read as the effect of tyranny. It was, on the contrary, the practice that protected English colonists from tyranny. Likewise, those caught in the snare of the Atlantic slave trade were no longer understood as individuals who were entitled to political remedy or even as part of a political conversation aimed at securing justice. One of the first acts of the newly installed royalist government on Barbados in 1661 was to sign into law an act for the better ordering and governing of Negroes, which, as Jenny Shaw points out, quote, codified Africans as chattel and provided more protections for their owners than for the subjects of the legislation. 1 year later, in 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses ensured that the children of English colonists and enslaved African women were cut off from the remedies and liberties English common law had afforded to the white children of English colonists, declaring that such children were partus sequitur ventrum, that their status followed the legal status of their mothers. The Virginia Slave Code not only enshrined a regime of racial and sexual violence, it forever barred generations from what William Waldron characterized as the, quote, just liberties of the people. The collapse of the tyrant slave dyad in 1659 effectively insulated slave owners in the British Atlantic from accusations of tyranny. It also deprived those who they oppressed and trafficked of any possibility of political remedy. That's it.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and perfectly to time. I was just sending you, please wrap up in the next 2 minutes thing, and you wrapped up. Well, perfection. Let people have a chance to express their gratitude and thanks, and then please either raise your hand, use the raise hand function, or type a question into chat. I've just gone on to the portrait view, so hopefully if anyone's raising their hands, I'll catch you quickly. Okay, Anna. Right. This is general effusions of how marvelous it was, which it absolutely was. I think we're bowled over.
I think Carrie has her hand up.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Carrie, you do have your hand up, and Steve does too. So Carrie first, and then Steve.
Thank you. I realise it's not very clearly visible there. Thank you. That was just incredible and really, really interesting, and so much to think about, especially the opening line of Equiano, which I had never put in that particular context. So thank you very much for that. So the people I read on this history, Melissa, as you know, are often, you know, people like Gerald Horne and Cedric Robinson and Tyler Stovall, and they all link a lot of the narrative of what you've covered here in other primary documents to the project of what they call the project of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered, like, would you be in broad agreement with that argument that, I mean, this is from Horne's The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism, that from the outset, there was a basis for moving towards a whiteness that transcended ethnic and then religious boundaries from the outset. And he's talking about 1619, but also 1627 when they arrive the English people arrive in Barbados. Mm-hmm. Those two moments from the outset, that the mutual interest in exploiting Africans and indigenous people in the Americans not only generated whiteness, but also fomented the lessening of religious conflict that had so devastated Europe. And so I'm just wondering, with the very detailed particulars you've given us, you know, between the republicanism and the monarchism, but also between, you know, there's religious liberties fomenting underneath that. Would you agree that this is about the formation of a project of whiteness specifically within retail capitalism?
Yeah, I do 100%. I'm sort of, so I would say that the association of religious liberty with whiteness has a longer tail, perhaps than the association of whiteness with political liberty. And so some of the things that are kind of bouncing around the back of my head are the implications of what's going on kind of narrowly focused in 1659 for the legacy of English political thought, really kind of right up to, especially in America, the 3/5 compromise, right? As building the foundations for what made that possible. And the thing the one thing I forgot to mention here is that, as I'm sure you know, Jennifer Morgan has this incredibly eloquent question at the beginning of her recent book, where she says, you know, the question we really need to be thinking about is, how did the obscene logic of racial capitalism come to make sense to people, right? And I think that this is a critical component of building that logic. So yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Carrie.
So much. And Steve, can you ask your question, please?
Yes, thanks, Melissa. That was fantastic. I'm wondering, you know, as we kind of track this logic as it emerges, I'm wondering I'm just wondering about the overall shape of it. So I'm thinking about, for example, the 1688 Germantown Petition, where, you know, it feels like a kind of language, it's a kind of golden rule language, but is still available to these kind of dissident kind of Moravians, weirdly in Philadelphia. And of course, the hierarchy there doesn't know what to do with it. So that's kind of one end of a kind of early moment of departure from, we might say, the displacement of at least some discourse around political right by both whiteness and economic necessity. And then I'm thinking about Wedderburn on the very other side of this kind of long history, and the way he's still using what we might take as kind of radically Protestant arguments that date back to the 1640s as a way to link both arguments for political right for white people or for kind of British citizens, so-called, but also calling for the possibility of further revolt in Jamaica. So I'm wondering in some sense, as you're thinking about the project as a whole, where do you see this kind of finally consolidated, and was it ever kind of fully consolidated? I guess would be by thinking about those two examples, one in the 1680s, one in the latter part of the period as we normally think of it.
Right. No, that's it. That's a great question. It's always like sort of tracking the tail of these ideas, I think is always a historical challenge. It does linger into the 1680s. So I have another piece of this project, which is on Orinoco, and about rereading that novel as a kind of claim that the enslaved Africans in Suriname were deserving of the right to rebel, right? So kind of looking at the language that Orinoco uses to mobilize and motivate the other slaves in the colony is right out of the 1640s. And that's it. I know that that's like a very much against the grain reading, but I think it does kind of align that novel, if I remember correctly, like with the language in the Germantown Petition. So it's a little hard to tell. I mean, some people would argue that the political radicalism, or at least the rhetoric of the political radicalism, lingers into the 1680s and kind of swirls around the exclusion crisis and Monmouth's rebellion. So bits and pieces of it are there, but it's in the 1680s, especially where the question of enslavement is concerned, it is less and less frequently generalized, right? It becomes more explicitly about English rights in that period. And so, you know, it kind of fades away. And I think that there are bits and pieces of it that emerge in the debate about abolition, with which I'm less familiar at the end of the 18th century. But my argument, at least what I'm thinking about right now, is that by the time we get to the end of the 18th century, it's a moral argument, or it's an argument about natural rights, and it's no longer an explicitly political argument. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks. It did, and we'll keep talking. There are lots of other people I'm sure who want to ask questions. So
Okay.
thank you.
Is there another question from the floor?
Could I just tag into that end
You
of that
can, but
conversation?
I'm going to take chair's privilege as well because I want to ask a question too. But go ahead, Carrie.
Okay, just to say that I think a lot of the anxiety about this plays out very clearly in Haiti, and in the way in which free Black people in Haiti use the arguments of French liberty for themselves, and then that's an interesting way to track. And then again, we can see the whiteness project because it's, oh no, not you. You're not entitled to French liberty, and that's why they get so anxious about particularly mixed race liberties and people. So you can start, that. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Right, I am going to take chair's privilege because it's been so fascinating, and the conversation particularly Carrie's thing about sort of extending the whiteness argument makes me think of the way that these rhetorics are almost parodied by Dryden in plays like Don Sebastian, where the underplot, the kind of comic farcical underplot is making a mockery of the political arguments for to not be a slave, and the kind of the rehearsing of those rhetorics for laughs. And I was just wondering if you thought about or had any comment on the kind of generic uses of these rhetorics for comedic effect or in other texts.
So that's a great question. My usual sort of habitat is prose and prose fiction. So I've dabbled in drama only slightly. But it makes, from my perspective, it makes perfect sense that Dryden and other, sort of court-aligned dramatists would hold up that language for ridicule. There's so much of it, and it's really pretty vicious in the early 1660s in the pamphlet literature. Like Roger Lestrange is sort of chief offender as far as I can tell. He just has no use, certainly for the arguments, since they brought down the monarchy, but even for the rhetoric, he ridicules things like the people's power, and the assumption that they have a right to say in their form of government. So, but I think even going to Ben's play, The Roundheads, the way she makes fun of Lambert and Desborough and sort of wants to reduce their political alignment to just sort of another romantic subplot. Yeah, it's all about discrediting that. And it's, there are kind of two approaches to the way that people discredit that. There's the sort of internal political argument, which is that the Stuarts and their allies remained concerned about lingering radicalism and the threat to the stability of the crown. But I also think that we have not paid enough attention to the way the royalist discrediting of political radicalism in England really enables and facilitates the Stuarts' imperial ambitions.
No, that's great. There's so much to think about. It makes me want to reread all those plays that are doing both of those projects simultaneously. So we have 1 minute left. Technically, Jenny, time for you to ask your question.
Oh, hello. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Jenny.
It's so nice to see you. That was, yeah, it's really good. I'm a very question born of ignorance and curiosity, which is around, because you talked about the slave tyrant dyad throughout the paper, but the title of the book project as it's emerging is a triad, right? So who are the heroes? Where did they come from? Because Because I mean, you know, when Equiano say, "Well, I'm not a saint, I'm not a tyrant, I'm not a hero," I've always understood that. I will now never see it the same way, of course, but I've always understood that in terms of, you know, whose lives get told and who are worth the telling, and the kinds of modes in which we tell those lives and those stories. But so I can understand it in the sort of limited Equiano context, I guess. But I'm just thinking about, are there any heroes, and are there going to be any heroes in this project?
So that's a really interesting question, and I this is like really speculative and tentative on my part, but I feel like there is an added dimension to this kind of political imagination. And you know, in at the same time that enslaved Africans are being kind of aligned with royalism, they're also being collectivized. Right. So there's a real, like, the part of the anxiety about the rebellion is that they will organize themselves and share information in a way that's not accessible to the colonizers. And that particular anxiety, I wouldn't say is the same, but it's definitely connected to the anxiety about collective action in the 1640s. And so I think, you know, in the book, I talk about the opposition between, I can't remember the phrase, but it's something like, oh, history is heroic exploit, right? So, you know, heroes are a big feature of kind of aristocratic royalist discourse, but they're always pitted against a kind of collective commonality, that their heroism exists because they are not that, right? And so I think that as I continue to work on this project, that's something that I really want to take up, is the anxiety about collectivism.
I was thinking about Orinoco in that context, since you mentioned
Right.
Orinoco. Yeah, I was thinking that would be fascinating. But yeah, thank you. It's great.
Thanks.
All that we have time left to do is to join together in thanking Melissa for a really phenomenal paper and a wonderful start to a year of ODSECS seminars. Please come and join us again in October when we have the rescheduled talk by Salima Kauchi on the affective turn in theatre in the long 18th century. So until then, be well, and thank you again, Melissa.
Thank you, everyone.
Well done. That was amazing.